Last week, journalism in Afghanistan was dealt a killer blow. 7 employees of the country's first ever 24-hour news network, Tolo TV, were killed when the Taliban targeted their bus in a bombing. Last year, the militant group declared the channel a military target, and this attack was a message to the rest of the Afghan media. The targeting of Tolo leaves Afghan journalists between a rock and a hard place, with the threat posed by the Taliban compounded by pressure from figures in the government to report on Afghanistan in a way that suits their version of the political and social story, that progress is being made. Until last week's attack on the media, government officials and those with links to them had been responsible for more threats against Afghan journalists over stories about corruption, land grabs, violence against women, and human rights abuses than the Taliban were. With the Afghan media under fire and under pressure, our starting point this week is Kabul.
در آغاز سرخط چند خبر ساعت پیش یک عمل انتحاری در جاده دارالامان رخ داد.
I saw breaking news on our channel that there was a car bomb.
حمله کننده مواد منفجره همراهش را در برابر یک موتر بس غیرنظامی منفجر ساخت.
That was when our head of news walked in, who said that we were the target. Our bus was hit by a suicide bomber. I didn't know how to react. I went down the stairs. You could see a lot of people on the phone trying to identify which van was it. How many people were hurt? How many people lost their lives? When I went there, it was a chaotic scene. We were trying to identify how many of our colleagues were lost in the attack. We deal with a lot of sad stories on a daily basis, but this was different, and we were affected directly.
البته باید گفت که موتر حامل کارمندان موبی گروپ شام امروز مورد حمله انتحاری قرار گرفت.
That evening we had to report on what happened, just as one other security incident.
The story behind this bombing goes back to last year when, after a long battle, the Taliban captured Kunduz, the first time it had taken a major city in Afghanistan since 2001. Afghans following the story on either Tolo TV or One TV saw reports of Taliban fighters being accused of rape. The militant group then denounced the 2 channels as satanic media, dealing in propaganda, and threatened to kill journalists from both.
Tolo and Channel Yak or Channel One have always been very critical of the Taliban. But I think it wasn't until the fall of Kunduz, which was a very strategic and important victory for the Taliban, when Tolo and Channel One reported about mass rapings of women by the Taliban. It invoked anger, and the Taliban claimed that this was a lie. And this is the reason that they said, okay, Tolo's employees and Channel One employees are military targets from now on.
I think the main fear of Taliban is that if people know what they are doing, because they are saying something and then doing quite differently. That's why they are very angry, because Tolo TV was broadcasting what really Taliban have done there.
What we did at Kunduz was to report what we were seeing and what we were hearing. We did a lot of sessions with our staff right after the threat to ensure that they are well informed about it, they're careful. So we took it very, very seriously. But unfortunately, a TV channel cannot protect the roads of a city of 5 million people, where every week a blast occurs and people die.
In the 5 years the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, starting in the mid-1990s, almost all modern forms of media were banned. It's been 14 years since they were driven from power by the US-led coalition, and Afghans now have 75 television channels and 175 radio stations to choose from. But over that decade and a half, 54 journalists have been killed, one by government forces, many by Taliban fighters. The group has moved out of the media dark ages, establishing a website and a presence on Twitter. But like any political movement, the Taliban does not speak with one voice or adhere to one policy. And that is reflected in its approach to the news media.
The Taliban are not the media-despising monsters anymore. Before, they were known for not allowing any media at all. But it's been a few years that they are very active, and they try to change the narrative by publishing their own information. It's kind of a counter information, because most of the information journalists get are either by the Afghan government or by NATO. So they try to change that.
I think that we should ask the Taliban what it is they do not want us to cover. But as journalists, it is our duty to cover the latest events. The Taliban are entitled to their views, but what is important to us as journalists is to portray the injustices that exist and uncover the latest events with an unbiased outlook. It is our job to let everyone know what is happening, even those who oppose us.
In a country that went from a near total media vacuum to a saturated broadcasting landscape in such a short time, the learning curve for everyone involved, journalists, politicians, and movements like the Taliban, has been steep. But ask any Afghan journalist and they will tell you they are more likely to be threatened over their reporting by someone from the government or the security services than by a militant armed with a gun. And sometimes, such as the case of Deutsche Welle correspondent Zerak Zahin, journalists can get it from both sides.
DW has around 20 correspondents in Afghanistan, all over the country. And one of them last year was taken hostage by the Taliban. They wanted to know whether he was a spy or not. And the only reason he was set free was because he was working for DW, which is a German broadcaster, and not an American organization. And what happened next was that the Afghan intelligence agency knocked on his door and said, "What are you doing here? You were with the Taliban, why did they set you free? Obviously you are working with them or something, otherwise they would have killed you." So there's pressure from all sides.
There are people inside the government of Afghanistan, especially in security offices and military offices, that they are not quite aware of sensitive work of media. They started to have links with the newsrooms of media outlets to put pressure on media. Not directly threaten media, but indirectly have the influence on media sector, which is very dangerous.
In reports which show a particular ministry or other government body in a positive light, naturally they'll support us. But if we're reporting a case of corruption, they'll not want to cooperate. To some extent, we're still threatened by the government on a daily basis. But at least with the government, it's possible to have a dialogue. The problem is being denied access to information, or to some extent, violence towards journalists, but not to the extent of killing journalists.
Voltaire, the French philosopher, wrote that to hold a pen is to be at war. That is where many Afghan journalists now find themselves. And when the pen is put to the sword, as it was in Kabul last week, the question becomes, the story becomes, what will those with the pens do now?
We are at a very critical juncture at the moment. This is about freedom, giving voice to a nation which was silenced for many decades in our recent history. This is what the Afghan media has given to the Afghan people, and I'm hopeful that we're still going to grow, because media and press freedom is something that the Afghan people want from the bottom of their heart.
On the download now, our viewers weigh in on the challenges and the dangers facing journalists in Afghanistan.
Taliban obviously doesn't like any propaganda against their mission or the atrocities they commit to civilians on a daily basis. So when they see anyone crossing that limit, they see them as an eligible target. On the other hand, the government has led the media to be as free as possible. We're very proud of our media because we see it as a very essential part of our democracy.
Sometimes journalists and media are also making mistakes by themselves. We want to broadcast or air in TV that should be accurate, that should be balanced, and should be confirmed by all sides or by two sides in Afghanistan. Sometimes we do mistake, honestly, and that caused the problem, and that caused that some people or some groups or some parties are attacking on a journalist.